Well, today I was listening to one of my favorite radio shows, Anti-War Radio with Scott Horton, which if anyone who's watching this is not familiar with him, which I think is common because I don't think he's that well known, Scott is an amazingly well-informed and intelligent interviewer. He's been covering libertarianism and foreign affairs, foreign policy for I think he started a radio show in '99 and pretty intensively full time for about 10 years now. And he's an anarcho-capitalist. He's actually interviewed many of the current luminaries uh, in the field, but mostly he's on anti-war radio, so mostly he covers foreign policy. Unfortunately, the only thing he seems to archive are his interviews. His shows have always been very interview based, and I mean, that's great. If you look, he's got 16 or 1700 interviews with probably close to 1,000 people, and that's awesome. But actually, I think it's kind of a shame because his own personal rants, if you want to call them, are very enlightening and actually kind of entertaining sometimes. So the only way I know of that you can really hear those is to listen to the show, which is, if you want to find it, it's on the Liberty Radio Network. Uh, 12 noon till 3 Eastern Standard Time every day, and I believe there's an encore performance once or twice, and it's on 5 days a week, obviously. So he said something today that I thought was interesting, and he said that, and apparently this is a saying, I'd never heard it before, that uh, Americans play checkers and Russians play chess. The implication being obvious that Americans are stupid and that Russians are smart. And I think the obvious meaning of the saying is false. Americans are not dumber than Russians. In fact, I actually think Russians may actually be dumber than average people because they went through a period where they literally were liquidating so many people that actually skewed towards those who question the state at all. And I mean, I've heard Yuri Maltsov say that uh, the only way you could really get through the last century was if you were a raging alcoholic. And I know that the alcoholism rates in Russia are really high. But other than that, obviously Americans are not stupid. It's kind of a cliche for Europeans to point out how little Americans know about the foreign policy of other countries, but I actually defend a lot of that. It's rational interest. There's no reason, rational ignorance. There's no reason that an American should know all the details about the border between, say, Belgium, or the Netherlands, or Germany, or France. These are countries that are thousands and thousands of miles away, any more than if you ask the average European about the border between Zambia and Botswana, they probably wouldn't know that much about it because it doesn't pertain to them a great deal. But if you also look, Americans have been enormously creative. In many ways, the world uh, is like in America. Our movies, our music, our technology, the internet is, I mean, is very much skewed an American thing. If you look at the top websites in the world, I think almost all of the top 10 are American sites. Uh, and if we expand it out even more, it's not just there in books and literature. I already mentioned music and movies, technology, you name it. Americans have demonstrated that they are second to no one in terms of intelligence. And we talk about, the cliche is that well, all these really smart Asians. Well, it's interesting because when you go to universities in the United States and you meet Asians, you are meeting the cream of the crop of, say, China or India. Japan doesn't send quite as many of their elites here because they have their own really good schools. But uh, when the smartest of the smart Chinese and the smartest of the smart Indians or whatever come to the United States, they are not peerless. Uh, there are Americans who are just as smart, if not smarter than they are. And the fact that we would be comparing basically the intelligentsia of the entire world against just the intelligentsia of 5% of the world, and and comparing it favorably, I think, says a lot. But the saying, I think, does have meaning. Because if you look at the policies of our government, especially the foreign policy of our government, it is retarded. It is insane. And the analogy is very apt. And this is every time I really look at current foreign policy, or if I read about historical policies in any detail, you are immediately struck by how unbelievably insane that they are. They are flippant. They change course on a whim. They do things without any justification that are even counterproductive to the stated goals of the nation. They don't in any way reflect the national interest. Just to give you a couple examples, during the operation after the United States invaded Iraq, the idea was, well, we'd have to rebuild Iraq to be prosperous again. And so they had all these different agencies. So there was people who were going to try and make the universities better, and the schools, and the sewage, and everything, the oil. And I'm getting this from the book Imperial Life in the Emerald City Inside America's Green Zone, which I just read like last month, which is a really good book. At one point, they talk about the guy who was going to be in charge of all the hospitals and all the medical treatment in Iraq. And of course, the top guy was just a bureaucrat, but he wanted to find somebody who would be really well qualified to handle, the hospitalizations, the medical facilities of the entire country. And he found this man who he was an American, but he'd gone to Harvard, to Yale, to Cambridge, and to Oxford. He was in the military. He had done battlefield surgeries, like he'd been deployed to Kosovo, Somalia, the first Gulf War. This guy had first-hand experience with battlefield injuries, next to no one. He had experience in high-level administration of war zones, medical zones. So this guy was the most credentialed person in the United States by far, maybe the most credentialed person in the entire world, and he picked him to head up the hospitals. And before they even got to go to Iraq, he got a call from Donald Rumsfeld saying, you can't have that guy go. He's not right for the job, because this guy wasn't even a Democrat. He just wasn't Republican enough. And instead, they picked a guy who was a Republican donor to the governor of Michigan, who ran a charity for children who have cleft palates. Nothing against a charity who runs for children with cleft palates, but that guy didn't know shit. And it wasn't like he was cheaper or the other guy was raping people or anything like that. They just picked a vastly inferior guy over a vastly superior guy with enormous detriment to their own plans, and it seems really, really short-sighted and insane. And that's just one tiny, I mean, we could go on. You can go back to the Civil War and be, they have political appointed generals, they have people avoiding the draft, they have, by paying. You have silly tariffs and that sort of thing. And the reason that the saying is valid is that it's not that the politicians in the United States are stupid or that the people in the bureaucracy are stupid. There's a lot of really intelligent people in the military. There's a lot of really intelligent people in the State Department. I mean, American society has, most Americans stay in the United States, but there's a whole lot of Americans who are basically bicultural, who grow up in all over parts of the world. I mean, I knew people who, parents were missionaries and they just grew up in other countries, and they speak perfect English and they're Americans, but they know everything about where they're from. And there's millions and millions of people who do that for missionary work, for business, for all kinds of, or because they're immigrant, because so many people have immigrated here, and the government has these people to draw on, and yet they are misused so horribly. And why is that? What's the reason? What's the difference between, say, the American government and, say, the Russian or the Chinese? And I say the difference is the incentives. When you have an elective democratic government like the United States, all politics is domestic, and all politics are based on what's going to do the most to guarantee that you get reelected. So, whereas if you are Vladimir Putin, that really doesn't matter to you to one degree. I know he's not technically the dictator. If you're in charge of China, that really doesn't matter to you. And you can look and say, how am I going to run this foreign policy for my goals in the long run? And they can pursue a long-run rational policy. I'm not saying that I agree necessarily with what China or Russia do. I'm just saying that their leaders are in a position to say what's going to be the long-term goal here, and they can have a consistent, coherent policy. You know, firing the highly qualified medical person for this Republican shill doesn't make any sense in terms of foreign policy long-term objectivism. It makes perfect sense, though, when you consider it in the vein of this is helping my next election. He's divvying out political favoritism, which is so rampant and obviously detrimental to the policies that even the government, even assuming that the policies the government wants are good, it's amazing, but that's what the incentive is. If Bush didn't get, and that, I mean, if you read that book, Inside the Emerald City, that was just, that example was glaring only to the degree to which one guy was so much better than the other, but it was all that way. Everybody, every position there was picked politically, and sometimes, very often, blatantly. I mean, you're talking about, it was mostly staffed by kids of powerful Republicans, or and this is what gets them to donate to the, and Obama's the same way. And I also think this is really glaring with terms to Iran. Now, I don't believe in the whole national security, national greatness, Zbigniew Brzezinski, grand chessboard stuff. I'm past that. I think it's really evil. But if I did believe that, the policies we have towards Iran are fucking retarded. Iran would be our natural ally. Why? Because they're Shiites. And most of our enemies are Sunnis, especially Al-Qaeda, and before that, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is our enemy, although not really. He never really did anything to us. He was our puppet. And by getting rid of him, we helped Iran enormously. Iran's #1 enemy with Saddam Hussein. I remember this when we invaded Iraq. People in Iran were chanting, "Death to Saddam, death to the United States." And they eventually got half of that. And the way things are going, who knows about the second half. If you look in Afghanistan, same thing actually. They were deadly enemies of the Taliban. They actually almost invaded the Taliban in 2000. The Taliban rounded up a whole bunch of Iranian diplomats and basically beheaded them as spies. And that did not go over well in Tehran. They ended up not doing anything about it. However, when we invaded, they did cooperate with us. It was actually in the news when it happened. I remember that American Special Forces, like the Taliban would try and flee into Iran, and they'd immediately be arrested or killed or turned over to the Americans. There was some degree of cooperation there. And that has happened many times. In Iran, the government of Iran has approached the United States on numerous occasions saying, okay, what do we want to do to be friends? There's no reason for us to be enemies. Strategically, we want to buy their oil. We have technical expertise that they do not have. There's no reason for them to be our enemy. The reason that they're our enemy is because some people in the Zionist movement cannot stand to have any other states other than Israel, and they have influence in the United States. There's also people in the United States who are just nationalists, and they cannot stand any independent country at all. And so the fact that if a country doesn't bend over, that to us, they take that as aggressive, and they put them in line. But I'm bringing this up now because just today it turned out that the Iranians apparently shot down a stealth drone. Looked like a stealth fighter. Maybe they didn't shoot it down. It's possible it just had mechanical problems. I don't know. But this is what really pisses me off about that, okay? Here you and me and everyone in America has been taxed all this trillions of dollars over the years. And our military has all these talented scientists and workers and labor and expensive resources to develop and build these extremely dangerous, deadly weapons, and of course that means that we're all denied the talents of the people who create them. There's a brain drain. We could all have magic refrigerators or whatever at this point, but instead we get to have these stealth drones. But then what happens is our retarded government trying to be antagonistic towards Iran fucking loses it in Iran, and now what's going to happen is Iran is going to give it to China and Russia. So evil countries, and I do consider the governments of Iran and Russia to be evil, just like I do all other governments, but those two more than most. They're just going to get the technology for this drone that you and I had to pay for. You know, talk about a subsidy. I mean, we're taxed trillions of dollars. I wonder what the R&D on this drone was. If it was less than $50 billion, I would be really surprised. Not to mention the actual costs of running it. And now, China or Russia or both and Iran, they just get the prototype right there. And I saw the video. It's pretty much all there. And the military they're trying to play it down. But and this just pisses the hell out of me. You know, you tax me, you build a weapon, and then you give it to, you know, somebody who could possibly use it against me, and then you're going to use that as probably as justification that we need to tax it even more. I mean, they take our money, and then they use it for means that have nothing to do with defending us, that actually make us less safe, that piss people off, and then they fucking have butterfingers with it, and they lose it. Oh, here's the other thing. If they shot it down, if Iran was able to shoot down one of our stealth fighters, shows how much we're getting for our money there. How stealthy it is. Apparently not very. Unless it had mechanical difficulties, which I guess is possible. Everyone's saying Iran shot it down. I don't know if we really know that or not. So, this argument here is very similar to the Hoppian argument. When you have democracy, the incentives are such that you can't have really a coherent policy. And this is evident, I mean, if you study our policy towards Afghanistan. You have, with Reagan, you had one policy. With George H.W. Bush, you had another one. Clinton never really figured out what he wanted, and all the while there were American people in the CIA, there were people in the State Department who really knew a lot about Afghanistan, and were saying, well, this is this is the way it is, and if we're going to have a policy, this is what it should be, and that just never happened because that doesn't fit with, you know, Clinton is courting the Indian vote, while as Reagan was courting the Pakistani vote, or not the vote so much as the many of them who vote, but, you know, donations from prominent. I mean, literally, like our policy in Pakistan was affected by Indian donors to the Democratic Party, to Bill Clinton, and that's just one tiny. And I hate to single him out because it's like this all across the board. The incentives for these elected leaders is not to have any semblance of a rational policy. It is whatever it takes to get reelected. And so the foreign policy is, I mean, domestically, sometimes this will lead to coherent policies because the domestic situation doesn't change as much. But in foreign policy, it just means that it's batshit crazy all the time, and which is extremely expensive and counterproductive, and it's dangerous. And this is the thing, is Scott Horton talks about this a lot with Iran. A war with Iran would be absolutely horrible, and that's assuming that it didn't involve other countries like Russia or China, which that would be the worst possible situation. But let's assume that it was only a war with the United States and Iran. That would be a fucking disaster. All of our troops who are in Iraq and Afghanistan would be fucked. Straits of Hormuz would be closed, which would mean the world economy would fucking explode practically. And look, Iran is not Iraq. Iran is fucking Colorado. It's a huge country filled with mountains, 3 times the size, 4 times the population. Mountains everywhere. It's not like the Tigris and Euphrates River basins. And they're not threatening in the sense that they could invade us, but they apparently have the ability to shoot down our drones. They have the ability to shoot the hell out of the Navy in the Persian Gulf. And it's my understanding that people in the military know this, and the only reason we haven't gone to Iran yet is because high up people in the military have told the president, we're against this. This is stupid. This is insane. The only way we could win would be to like literally invade and occupy the entire country, and that would take probably 1 million soldiers. You know, and then there'd be a real war with 1 million soldiers, and that's assuming like China and Russia didn't get involved, and that's fucking crazy. And then from Israel's point of view, Iran has the power to hurt Israel. Even if they don't have a nuke, they have the power to hurt Israel. Their terrorist network has the power to hurt Israel. They have missiles that can hit Israel. And this whole fear that Iran might get the bomb, so what? Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs. The United States has thousands of nuclear weapons. Second strike capabilities for both, because Israel has nuclear submarines that can do subsurface launches. So even if the Iranians nuked Tel Aviv, they would still be obliterated, and they know that. And this whole argument that they're crazy just doesn't make any sense. Also, they're religiously against nuclear weapons. People who don't realize this, in the Iraq-Iran war, Iraq used poison gas against Iran. The Iranian generals went to the Ayatollah Khomeini and they said, Iraq's using chemical weapons against us. We need to use them back. And he said, that is against Islam. That is a sin. We cannot do that. Here they're getting gas, and they refuse to do it on religious grounds. And Ayatollah Khomeini said about 50 years ago that nuclear weapons are against Islam. They can't be used. Now, that doesn't mean everyone in Iran believes that, but apparently it's a pretty significant thing. But even if they had a nuke, they wouldn't be crazy and use it. They have one nuke, they use it. Oh, now what? Nothing. They're just asking to become annihilated if that were to ever happen. But, so there's no reason to go to war with Iran, but what? The fucking Republican hawks, if Obama doesn't attack Iran, will say, oh, Obama's being Munich, he's letting there be another Hitler. Which I'll come back to that in a second. And since Obama doesn't want to lose the election, and Obama doesn't want to look like a peacenik or a dove, in order to up his electoral chances, he might just go to war anyway, even though that would be a huge disaster, and basically risk Armageddon. And that's how crazy it is. They would literally risk Armageddon to up their chances in the next electoral cycle. I'm not kidding. That's where we're at. And so yeah, that's worse than checkers versus chess. It's just, I don't even know. It's fucking insane. And they're playing Russian roulette with like the whole world, and they're so short-sighted because of their incentives that they don't even see it. The other thing is they have less disincentive, because if there ever was a nuclear holocaust, well, Barack Obama has a Marine who follows him with a lead jacket. He's got a ticket on a nuclear-proof plane to any number of underground bases where he could survive, and so could Nancy Pelosi and a couple other people. The rest of us, we would all be fucking dying, getting irradiated, melted, living in fucking Mad Max, but he's going to be able to live. So he has less incentive to worry about it than the rest of us, because he's not going to pay the price for his insanity, for his short-sightedness. And, oh yeah, and this is the kind of the tangential thing. The argument kind of here is we don't want another Hitler. It's weird, because Hitler is depicted simultaneously as this one-time, singular, most evil person ever, and yet every time we ever want to go to war with anybody, it's suddenly they're another Hitler. I hate for people to break this, but Germany was fucking not even a hegemon in Europe. They had no chance of ever winning that war, and yet Germany is like many, many times more powerful in relative terms than Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or Somalia or Uganda or Central African Republic or Libya or Yemen. Am I forgetting anybody here? Probably, unfortunately. So the incentives of the political structure is what make the politics so fucking stupid, which makes the policy so retarded. It's not because Americans are stupider or dumber than Chinese or Russians. I actually think that's not the case. If you ever read Anthony C. Sutton's book on Western technology and the Soviet Union, Russians are actually are pretty smart, actually, but at least they used to be before the 20th century. But Americans are smart too, but the smart Americans are are the capitalists, are the ones who aren't in government. And as soon as they get in government, the incentives are such that their smarts don't do them any good. They use their smarts and all their intelligence to get reelected. And they just do all this political calculus, and if the political calculus says go to war with Iran, then they do. Or if the political calculus says aid the Mujahideen but don't aid the Taliban, then they do. If right now the calculus says they help terrorist organizations in Iran, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, the PKK, and Jandala, all these communist, Shiite, and Salafist. Salafist is the name that Saudis call their religion. We call them Wahhabists in the West, but they call themselves Salafists. You know, you always hear, oh, they're so bad. Well, we fund Salafists in Iran. We fund communists in Iran because they're terrorists and they're against Iran for whatever reason. Being anti-Iran is good political calculus because of the AIPAC, and among other reasons, because there's a lot of non-Jewish conservatives who are just fucking hawks to the max, and they think that Sable radialing at Iran is good policy for some reason. So, yes, it's not that Americans are stupid, it's that government is stupid. No one should be surprised that I said that, though, right?